Okay. Let's pray as we begin the Bible study. Dear loving Father, thank you for such a wonderful afternoon and morning. You brought us together to share your word. May you be with us and help us understand from your word. In Jesus Christ's name we prayed. Amen. Amen. Yep. So we got to the book of Esther. Yeah. Book of Esther. Oh, you're there, right? Okay, so what's in the book of Esther?
So, just a brief overview of the Book of Esther. This is now a time in which the Persian Empire is ruling, and it has dominion over 127 provinces,
Okay.
ranging from India to Ethiopia.
Okay.
So it's widespread across the vast um, majority of the then known world at that time,
Yeah.
and we're brought now into quite an interesting story of Esther,
Yeah.
which I think one of the key things to understand going into it is that not once was then God ever mentioned
Yeah.
in the book of Esther. Yet God is the one who's actually orchestrating everything,
Yeah.
to the extent that He prevented then the genocide of the Jews through Esther.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, so we begin from Esther chapter 1. Esther chapter 1, I read. It was in the days of Hauxelas or Zexus, who reigned from India to Ethiopia, over 127 provinces. In those days, when the king Xerxes sat on the royal throne, which at the citadel in Susa, the capital of Persian Empire, in the third year of the reign, he held a banquet for all his officials and his attendants, the army officers of Persia and Media, the nobles, the officials of the province were there in his presence. And he displayed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the splendor of his great majesty for many 180 days in all. That was a long one. Okay. When these days were completed, the king held a banquet for all the people who were present at this. No, there were curtains of fine white violet linen fastened with cords of fine purple linen to silver rings and marble columns, the couches of gold and silver reseated on the mosaic floor of perennial marble, mother of pearl and precious colored stones. Drinks were served in various kinds of golden goblets, and royal wine was plentiful in accordance with the generosity of the king. King was carried on in accordance with the law. No one was compelled to drink, for the king had directed each official of his royal household to compel with each guest's wishes. Interesting. Queen Vashti also held a separate banquet for women in the palace of the king Xerxes. On the seventh day, when the king's heart was joyful with wine in high spirit, he commanded Mehuman, Bethasa, Habona, Bigata, Abatha, Zitha, Carcass, the seven units who served in the presence of the king Xerxes as his attendants, to bring Queen Vashti before the king, wearing her royal gown, her turban, to display her beauty before the people and the officials, for she was lovely to see. But the Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command, which was delivered to her and burned with rage. The king spoke to the wise men who understood the times, asking for advice, for it was the custom of the king to speak before all those who were familiar with the law and legal matters, and who were close to him as advisors. Kashena, Sheatha, Admatha, Tanish, Meres, Mashena, Meunakan, the seven officials of Persia and Media who had access to the kings were ranked highest in the kingdom. He said, according to the law, what is to be done to the queen Vashti, because she did not obey the command of the king Xerxes, which was conveyed by the eunuchs. And Menucan answered in the presence of the king and officials. Vashti the queen had not only wronged the king, but also all the officials, royal representatives, and all the people who were still the provinces of Xerxes. For the queen's conduct will be known to all women, causing them to look on their husband with contempt, disrespect, since they will say, King Xerxes commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, and she did not come. This very day, the ladies of Persia and Media, who have heard the queen's refusal, will speak in the same way to all king's officials, and there will be plenty of contempt and anger. If it pleases the king, let a loyal command be issued by him, and let it be written in the law of the Persia and the Medes, so that it cannot be repeated or modified, that Vashti is no longer to come before the king Houses. Let the king give her royal position to another who is better and more worthy than she. So the king's great decrees proclaimed throughout his extensive kingdom. All women who give honor to their husbands, from the great to the insignificant. This statement advice pleased the king, and the officials and the kings did what Memucan proposed. So he sent letters to all the royal provinces, to each province in his own script, to each people in their own language, saying that every man should be the master and the rule of his own home, and he should speak in a household in the language of his own people. What do we see here?
Okay. Okay, so essentially what we then have now in the introduction
Yeah.
is the defiance of Queen Vashti
Yeah.
to now Xerxes.
Mm-hmm.
And we can now see that it is now this really, it caused him to burn with anger and discontent.
Yeah.
And the main gist of it is that the royal court and the king himself fears that women will now rise up over their husbands, over the leaders of their household, and which is now a great concern that now, which is now where I think the room or the space is now being created for someone else to now be queen.
Okay. Interesting. Anything more?
We have to establish that the reason why Vashti refuses to appear before the king Ahasuerus is, like it says in the beginning, that where do they talk about drinking? That there was no law about drinking. They did not drink in accordance to what should have been the way of drinking, but they drank as every man pleased. That's what the king had commanded. Yeah. So whatever you wish, drink as much as you want. So the queen, seeing that these men are drunk and they are disrespecting themselves, I cannot appear in front of the king in such a manner. This rather does not put her at a place where she point to forget about you being queen and you having whatever thoughts that you have about the king and appearing because the king commands you to do so. And I guess that was, I don't know if you look at the way the Bible is structured, when a king is a king and he says something should be done, no matter how stupid the thing is. Which is why in the end we have verses telling us that if people are led by the wrong person, multitudes will suffer.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we have to notice just that at the beginning we see the wrong people doing the wrong thing, but because of certain principles that already are there set by the law, she gets to suffer being thrown away from it. But if you actually think of it in a human sense, in a Christian sense, you'd be like, but these men were drunk, and she had no right to appear amongst men that are drunk. They're disrespecting themselves. Yeah. And imagine that these are big people, royals, and all kinds of people gathered together, and they want to call a sober queen to come and sit before the king, who is drunk, who might even disrespect her in front. And what will the people that are watching in front, what will they say?
Yeah.
All of that is not considered, but the law is put into place and they say, let's stop it. That's where they go. Yeah.
It also talks about the kind of advices the king had.
Exactly.
How do they judge the situation? Yeah. If they only judge they are being irrational, looking at queen's side only, not looking at their side of the coin, then that brings that calls us for the kind of leadership still we still have. Says when we have the right when the right leader comes in place, then justice will be over the kingdom. When the wrong leader comes in, we're having people suffering. Yeah, so leadership is also very important in this first chapter of Esther. Okay, chapter 2.
Chapter 2. After these things, when the wrath of the king Osiris or Xerxes had subsided, he remembered Vashti and what she had done, and what had been decreed against her. And the king's attendants who served him said, let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king. Let the king appoint administrators in all the provinces of his kingdom, and have them gather all the beautiful young virgins to the citadel in Susa, into the harem, under the custody of Hegai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women, and let their beauty preparations be given to them. Let the young woman who pleases the king be queen in place of Vashti. This pleased the king, and he did accordingly. There was a certain Jew in the citadel of Susa, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, and the son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been deported from Jerusalem with the captives who had been exiled from Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had exiled. He was the guardian of Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter. For she had no mother, no father or mother. The young woman was beautiful of form and face, and when her father and mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So it came about when the king's command and his decree were proclaimed that when young women were gathered together in the citadel of Susa into the custody of Hegai, Esther was taken to the king's palace, provided her with beauty preparations and her portion of food. And he gave her 7 choice maids from the king's palace, that he transferred her and her maids to her best place in the harem. Esther did not reveal the Jewish background of her people or her family, for Mordecai had instructed her not to do so. Every day, Mordecai, who was an attendant of the king's court, walked back and forth in front of the courtyard to the harem to learn how Esther was getting along, and what was happening to her. Now, it was each young woman's turn to go before King Osiris after the end of the 12 months under the regulations for the women. For the days of their beautification were completed as follows: 6 months with oil and myrrh, and 6 months with sweet spices and perfumes, and beauty preparations for women. Then the one woman would go before the king in this way. Anything that she wanted was given to her to take with her from the harem into the king's palace. In the evening, she would go in, and the next morning she would return to the second harem, to the custody of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the concubines. She would not return to the king unless he delighted in her, and she was summoned by name. Now, as for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her in as his own daughter, when her turn came into the king, she requested nothing except that Haggai, the king's eunuch, an attendant who was in charge of the women, advise, and Esther found favor in the sight of all who saw her. So Esther was taken to King Cyrus, to his royal palace in the 10th month. That this, the month of Tebeth, December to January, in the 7th year of his reign. Now the king loved Esther more than all other women, and she found favor and kindness with him more than all other virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen in the place of Vashti. Then the king held a great banquet, Esther's banquet, for all his officials and his servants, and he made a festival for the provinces, and gave gifts according with the resources of the king. And when the virgins were gathered together the second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Esther had not revealed her family or her people, that is, her Jewish background, just as Mordecai had instructed. For Esther did what Mordecai told her, just as when she was under his care. In those days, while Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs, who guarded the door, became angry and conspired to attack King Osiris. And the plot became known to Mordecai, who informed Queen Esther, and Esther told the king in Mordecai's name. Now when the plot was investigated and found to be true, both men were hanged on the gallows, and it was recorded in the book of the Chronicles in the king's prison. This then is now chapter 2 of the book of Esther.
I see a plot down here.
Yeah, there's a plot down there. But I think we should then also give praise, or rather look into the mere fact that one of Esther's most defining principles that I think all Christians should look towards is just the extent of her humility and her obedience. She did not require to have any sort of, I don't know, adornments given to her so that she can present herself to the king. Instead, she went as herself with nothing but advice from the council that was around her. And we learn along Proverbs that the wise seek advice. And it's only fools who are not open to being advised. Right. So this then shows that she's quite an intelligent woman, as is, and it's something to be respected. As she also then mentioned to not the extent that she is now queen.
And purity still stands as a measure for you to be lifted. You see over the Bible, they're talking about the king choosing the wife, the king doing what. We remember the king, is a servant of God. Authority is given by God. So even in God's kingdom, purity still remains an essential part. He says the virgins were brought the king's presence, right? So what's a purity in Christianity? What's purity in spiritual life? Yeah. Yesterday we were talking about we're looking Psalms and 119.
Yeah.
I said I liked the 133, the verse 133 where it says, uh, help me that my weakness, my human weakness, does not separate me from God. So that's purity. That even when you think things are natural, things that go on, you should pray and work that they don't separate you from God, because they can separate you from God. Your heart, your heart is in a position where it's being fought. We look at three things yesterday. We looked at envy, we looked at dishonest gains, and we looked at uh, trusting God, right? Precepts of God. So your heart is between the three things. Envy is there, dishonest gains is there, then precepts of God are there. So what do you choose with your heart? Where you place yourself, that your heart should choose. So that's important, that even in everyday growth, we should look at growing in purity, growing following the precepts of God. Just like we see all these people being favored here, Esther being a very obedient person, even when she was told to not do this, she obeyed that, and that's it. Maybe if she said her identity, we don't know. If she said identity, she wouldn't get chance to go to the courts of the king, and maybe she wouldn't be able to save the people as is planned. But because she obeyed the first instructions, just like we are supposed to obey the instructions of God, yeah, she was able to be uplifted. Yeah. Okay. Um, anyone there?
You have anything to add? No. We can proceed with chapter 3.
Right. After these things, did King Ahasuerus promote Haman, rather, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and advanced him and set him his seat above all the princes that were with him. And all the king's servants that were in the king's gate bowed and reverenced Haman. For the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai bowed not, nor did his reverence to Haman. Then the king's servant, which were in the king's gate, said unto Mordecai, Why transgressest thou to the king's commandment? Now it came to pass when they spake daily unto him, and he hearkened not unto them, that they told Haman to see whether Mordecai's matters would stand. For he had told them that he was a Jew. And when Haman saw that Mordecai bowed not, nor did he reverence him, then was Haman full of wrath, and he thought scornfully to lay his hands on Mordecai alone, for they had shewed him the people of Mordecai. Wherefore Haman sought to destroy all the Jews that were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, even the people of Mordecai. In the first month, that is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, they cast Par, that is the lot, before Haman from day to day, and from the month to month, to the 12th month, that is the month of Adar. And Haman said unto King Ahasuerus, There is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed amongst the people in all the provinces of thy kingdom. And thy laws are diverse from all people, neither keep they the king's laws. Therefore it is not for the king's profit to suffer them. It is, if it pleases the king, let it be written that they may be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver to the hands of those that have charge of the business, to bring it into the king's treasuries. And the king told him or he took his hand and put the ring on his hand and gave it unto Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, and the Jew's enemy. Right. And the king said unto Haman, the silver is given to thee, the people also, to do with them as it seemeth good to thee. Then were the king's scribes called on, and 13 days of the first month, and there was written according to all that Haman had commanded, and the king and the king's lieutenants, and to the governors, and were that all that were over every provinces, and to the king's rulers, every people of every province, according to the writing thereof, and to every people after their language. In the name of King Ahasuerus was it written, and sealed with the king's ring. And the letters were sent by post into all the king's provinces to destroy, to kill, and to cause to perish all Jews, both young and old, little children and women, in one day, even upon the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to take the spoil of them for a prey. The copy of the writing for the king, for the commandment to be given in every provinces was published unto all people, that they should be ready against that day. And the post went out, being hastened by the king's commandment, and the decree was given in Shushan the palace. And the king and Haman sat down and to drink, but the city Shushan was perplexed, surprised what was declared.
Wow.
Chapter 3 of Esther.
So here I believe we see that there is a young man that is promoted from Norway, Haman,
Yeah.
who is the son of Hammedatha the Agagite. Since this man was respected so much of the king, that he decided to honor his son, so that his son be revered by all of the Persians and everyone in these kingdoms.
Yeah.
So it so happens that this Haman has to be given so much praise that everyone in the city, when Haman passes by, they bow at Haman. But we have Jews there, Jews like Mordecai.
Yeah.
And the biggest principle of Jews is to bow to no one else than their God.
Yeah.
They only bow to God. So if you bow to anybody, you're probably putting them above yourself as a God. So he refuses to bow. And it happens quite several times. I guess they were giving him mercy. First, second, third time, giving him mercy. And he decides that, nah, this is just too much. This man won't listen to me. So he goes to the king and he tells the king that, oh king, why don't we do this? This guy is a Jew. So there's certain kind of people in your kingdom. He doesn't tell him exactly that they're Jews. He just says like certain kind of people in your kingdom that do not take the commandments of the king. The king in turn gives him his ring because it's convincing. It's convincing that you want to destroy people that are against my commandments. That's very right to do. Do it. Gets the king's ring, and he writes thereof a commandment that should be sent to all of the kingdoms in their city, in their kingdom, that we have to kill the Jews on the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, on the 13th day of that month. And that is when they were going to kill all of the Jews, slaughter them, young, old, children, everyone. And they also planned that they will make sure that Haman gets the right punishment for disobeying and not revering the right man who is Haman. And if we go back to what the king says exactly, it's like, do unto them as
you see fit.
As it seems good to you. Yeah. And that statement and the way it's written, it just kind of deviates a bit, but it tells us a big thing, that we all have thoughts and wishes and things that we have in our brains.
Yeah.
And perhaps that is our nature of good. But the nature of good that every other person might say they're good in, because you hear atheists and people who do not believe in God claim they can be good and they can love in the manner that they love more than Christians.
Yeah.
But we cannot compare you to a Christian, because the Christian stands in the right path of God, and his principle of goodness is ruled by the place of God, not by any other kind of goodness that you might think. The guy thought what was good to do was to destroy all of these Jews.
Yeah.
And perhaps because he just wanted that prestige to himself. These are people who have a God, but he does not respect that. That is their business. And that's very key.
Yes, very key. It's funny how Haman is he acts like a sweet talker.
Yep.
Right. He sugarcoats his words. He comes to the king and tells him, you know what, there are people who don't respect you.
Exactly.
He wants to transfer his anger, his disregard for these people who don't respect him, not the king, to the king. They want. They say what they say. What's that? Misery needs company. So he wants to share the misery with the king. So he tells the king, no, you know what? He tells the king, they are people. He doesn't tell them it's Jews. It's maybe it's the race which is the queen's kind of things. There are people who don't regard you. It's like, give me your decree, give me permission, so that I'll go and destroy. And when I destroy them, I'll pay tens of thousands into your treasure. So he shows the king that the king is gaining, but he's not losing.
Right.
So he sugarcoats his message. He does not give the message as it's supposed to be full.
Exactly.
He just gives, and that's a very dangerous thing, because when you do that, is that you cause disaster not only to the people but yourself. Because you can imagine if the king comes to know the full information that you hid behind the veil, the king won't be happy with you.
Exactly.
Yeah. So he says, in a short term, it's just like a tablet, that sugar-coated tablet, just a short time to be sweet, but when it is gone, everything else is bitter, right? Yeah. So it's not a good way to live your kind of life.
Exactly.
Because that it makes you live a short time happy, but long than expected in misery.
Exactly.
So Haman here acts as a person who is a sweet talker and does not value the truth. And when you look at Mordecai's action of not bowing to Haman is an act, is reverence to God. It's like we don't bow to anyone else apart from God. And Haman takes it very personal. Yet his appointment to being promoted came as a gift. Yeah. So instead of treasuring that gift and doing what he's supposed to do, he's now starting using the gift to do the small little things that he was not supposed to do in the first place. So he's been promoted to help the king promote and grow his kingdom, but now he's now using the position to benefit, to enrich himself, and that's in now terms what we call corruption. Yeah, where someone will use his seat to enrich himself instead of what he was asked to do there. Yeah. Esther 3. Okay.
Okay, Esther 4, chapter 4. Now when Mordecai learned of everything that had been done, he tore his clothes in mourning, and put a sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the center of the city, and cried out loudly, bitterly. He went only as far as the king's gate, because no one was ever to enter the king's gate dressed in sackcloth. In each and every province that the decree, the law of the king, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting and weeping and wailing, and many lay on sackcloth and ashes. When Esther's maids and her eunuchs came and told her what had happened, the queen was seized by a great fear. She sent garments of cloth to clothe Mordecai so that he would remove his sackcloth, but he did not accept them. Then Esther summoned Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs, whom the king had appointed to attend her, and ordered him to go to Mordecai to find out what the issue was and why it had come about. So Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city, which was in front of the king's gate. Mordecai told him everything that had happened to him, and the exact amount of money that Haman had promised to pay to the king's treasuries for the destruction of the Jews. Mordecai also gave him a copy of the text of the decree which had been issued in Susa for the Jews' destruction, so that he might show Esther and explain to her, and order her to go into the king to seek his favor and plead with him for the lives of her people. Hathach came back and told Esther what Mordecai had said. Then Esther spoke to Hathach and ordered him to reply to Mordecai, saying, all the king's servants and the people of the king's province know that for any man or woman who comes to the king into the inner court without being summoned has but one law, that he is to be put to death unless the king holds out to him the golden scepter so that he may live. As for me, I have not been summoned to come to the king for these last 30 days. So they told Mordecai what Esther had said, and I have not been summoned to come to the king for these last 30 days. So they told Mordecai what Esther had said, and the king's palace can escape any more than all the Jews. For if you remain silent at this time, liberation and rescue will arise for the Jews night or day, and my maids will also fast in the same way. Then I will go in to see the king without being summoned, which is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went away and did exactly as Esther had commanded him. I think for this part, verse 14 is what then sticks out the most in chapter 4, which is then, if you remain silent at this time, liberation and rescue will arise for the Jews from another place, and you and your father's house will perish, since you did not help when you had the chance. And who knows whether you have attained royalty for such a time as this, and for this very purpose.
Yeah.
In our lives, we are put in favorable positions.
True.
By God.
True.
Not because we are better or best, but because we are favored by Him to fulfill a certain task. And should we not then fulfill that task, our families will not then stand to reap the benefits.
Yeah.
Instead, our families will perish.
Yeah.
We will be cut away from that position. We can look into the lives of, let's say, leaders and politicians whom have a purpose to fulfill. And when they do then not fulfill that purpose, eventually they get their due.
True.
So it is highly important to take into consideration the purpose in which our appointments that God gives place us in, as to what are we supposed to the king when he said to Haman, do as you see fit, the good that you desire to do. And now for Esther, she's required to use her position of power to now risk her life for her people.
Yeah.
Which is, it's not an easy task. So I think it's verse 14 is what stands out most.
Any more there? Or your robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace opposite his throne. The king was sitting on the royal throne facing the main entrance of the palace. When the king saw Esther, the queen, standing in the court, she found favor in his sight, and the king extended her golden scepter in the court. She found favor in his sight, and the king extended her golden scepter. King extended her golden scepter, which was in his hand. So Esther approached and touched the top of the scepter, sitting on the royal throne facing the main entrance of the palace. When the king saw Esther, the queen, standing in the court, she found favor in his sight, and the king extended her golden